Picture your grandmother tonight, sitting in her favorite chair around 8 in the evening, the television humming quietly in the background, and she is fighting to keep her eyes open, even though the clock has barely passed dinner time, because somewhere inside her body, a signal has already been sent that the day is ending, long before most of us would even think about winding down. And by the time she finally gives in and climbs into bed, her body has already been asking for sleep for almost 2 hours, and the question that almost nobody asks out loud is whether the time she goes to bed is actually helping her or quietly working against her, because after 70, bedtime stops being a simple habit and becomes a decision with real consequences for the heart, the brain, and the years still ahead. Before we go any further, if this kind of research-backed breakdown is useful to you, consider following smart psychology, because we spend our time digging through real studies on aging, sleep, and the mind instead of repeating vague wellness advice. And that support genuinely helps this kind of information reach more people who need it. Now let us actually talk about what is happening inside an aging body once someone crosses that 70-year mark, because the honest answer is that the body itself has quietly rewritten its own schedule. Every person carries what scientists call a circadian clock, a master timing system that lives in a small cluster of cells in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this clock controls when hormones rise and fall, when body temperature shifts, and when the brain releases melatonin, the hormone most responsible for making a person feel sleepy. In younger adults, this clock tends to release melatonin later in the evening, which is part of why teenagers and even people in their 30s and 40s often feel most alert late at night. But research published by sleep scientists, including Charles Czeisler at Harvard Medical School, has shown that as people age, this clock physically shifts earlier, a phenomenon researchers call an advanced sleep phase. Melatonin starts rising earlier in the evening, cortisol starts climbing earlier in the morning, and body temperature follows the same forward shift, which explains why so many people over 70 feel drowsy at 8 in the evening and wide awake at 5 in the morning, even if they fought against it for decades. This is not weakness, and it is not simply a bad habit picked up over the years. It is a measurable biological shift in timing that has been documented across thousands of participants in sleep laboratories. Doctors who specialize in geriatric sleep medicine now generally agree that fighting this shift, staying up late, because that is what a person did at 40, actually works against the body rather than with it. Dr. Michael Twerry, who spent years directing the National Center on Sleep Disorders research at the National Institutes of Health, has explained that trying to force an aging body to stay awake past its natural signal does not simply cause tiredness the next day, it disrupts the entire architecture of the sleep that follows. And that architecture matters enormously, because sleep itself changes dramatically with age, not just its timing. A person in their 20s spends a meaningful portion of the night in deep, slow-wave sleep, the stage where growth hormone is released, where muscle tissue repairs itself, and where the brain performs some of its most important maintenance work. By the time a person reaches their 70s, the amount of deep, slow-wave sleep they get each night can drop by more than half compared to their younger years, according to research compiled by sleep researchers such as Sonia Ancoli Israel at the University of California, San Diego. REM sleep, the stage associated with memory consolidation and emotional processing, also becomes shorter and more fragmented. The result is that older adults often wake up several times during the night, sometimes without even remembering it, and get less of the deep, restorative sleep stages that younger bodies produce easily. This is precisely why the timing of bedtime becomes so much more important with age, because an aging body that already produces less deep sleep per hour needs every available hour working in its favor, rather than being pushed later and later against its natural rhythm. Now here is where the actual research on bedtime timing becomes genuinely striking, because this is not simply a matter of comfort or feeling rested the next day. It appears to be tied directly to heart health and long-term survival. A large-scale study published in the European Heart Journal Digital Health in 2021, led by researcher Shahram Nikbaktian and colleagues at the University of Oxford, tracked over 88,000 adults using wrist-worn sleep trackers for an average of 6 years. What they found was that people who fell asleep between 10 and 11 in the evening had the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease, including heart attacks, heart failure, and stroke, compared to every other bedtime group studied. People who fell asleep after midnight had a 25% higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, and even people who went to bed unusually early, before 10 in the evening, showed a slightly elevated risk compared to the 10 to 11 window. The researchers proposed that going to bed too late disrupts the body's circadian alignment, throwing off the timing of blood pressure regulation, glucose metabolism, and inflammation control that are supposed to happen on a predictable nightly schedule. For a person in their 70s or 80s whose cardiovascular system is already carrying more risks simply due to age, this window becomes even more relevant because their heart has less reserve capacity to absorb the stress of chronic circadian misalignment. This is a good moment to pause and mention that if topics like this, the hidden biology behind aging well, are the kind of thing you want more of, Smart Psychology puts out this kind of breakdown regularly, and following along means you will not miss the next one. Beyond cardiovascular risk, there is also a growing body of research connecting sleep timing and sleep quality in older adults to brain health specifically. During deep sleep, the brain activates something called the glymphatic system, a network of channels first characterized in detail by neuroscientist Maiken Nedergaard and her team at the University of Rochester, which flushes cerebrospinal fluid through brain tissue and clears out metabolic waste products, including a protein called beta amyloid, the same protein that clumps together to form the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. This clearance process happens far more efficiently during deep, uninterrupted sleep than during fragmented, shallow sleep. When an older adult goes to bed too late, sleep tends to become more fragmented because it is fighting against the body's natural circadian signal rather than working with it, which means less efficient waste clearance night after night. Over years, this repeated inefficiency is one of the mechanisms researchers believe may contribute to the buildup of amyloid plaques associated with cognitive decline, although scientists are careful to note that sleep timing alone is one piece of a much larger picture that includes genetics, diet, physical activity, and social engagement. Still, the consistency of the pattern across multiple studies has led geriatric sleep specialists, including researchers affiliated with the National Sleep Foundation, to recommend a consistent bedtime somewhere between 9 and 10:30 in the evening for most adults over 70, aligned with the body's naturally advanced circadian phase rather than fighting it. Consistency itself turns out to matter almost as much as the specific hour chosen. A study out of Brigham and Women's Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, found that irregular sleep timing, going to bed at wildly different hours from one night to the next, was associated with a meaningfully higher risk of cardiovascular events, independent of how many total hours of sleep a person got. In other words, someone who consistently goes to bed at 9:30 every night is generally doing better for their long-term health than someone who goes to bed at 8 one night, midnight the next, and 10:30 after that, even if both people average the same total amount of sleep across the week. This makes sense once you think about the underlying biology, because the entire hormonal cascade tied to the circadian clock, including cortisol, melatonin, insulin sensitivity, and blood pressure regulation, depends on predictability. A body that receives a consistent signal every evening can prepare its systems in advance, lowering blood pressure gradually, shifting metabolism toward rest and repair, and releasing melatonin on schedule. A body that receives an inconsistent signal is constantly playing catch-up, and that chronic low-grade disruption compounds over months and years in ways that show up as measurable increases in disease risk. Now let us talk about what commonly gets in the way of a healthy bedtime for people over 70, because understanding the obstacles matters just as much as understanding the target. One of the biggest disruptors is evening light exposure, particularly from television screens, tablets, and phones held close to the face in the hours before bed. Light in the blue wavelength range, common in most screens, directly suppresses melatonin production by acting on light-sensitive cells in the retina that communicate straight to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. For a younger adult whose circadian system still has some flexibility, this suppression is a nuisance. For an older adult whose melatonin production is already naturally declining with age, since the pineal gland becomes less responsive over the decades, that same screen exposure can meaningfully delay the release of what little melatonin is still being produced, pushing bedtime later, and making the sleep that follows lighter and more fragmented. A second major obstacle is medication timing. Many older adults take medications for blood pressure, diabetes, or other chronic conditions, and some of these medications, including certain diuretics prescribed for blood pressure or heart failure, are more effective when taken earlier in the day rather than in the evening, since taking them too close to bedtime can cause frequent nighttime bathroom trips that fragment sleep repeatedly through the night. Doctors specializing in geriatric care generally recommend reviewing medication timing with a physician or pharmacist specifically with sleep in mind, since a simple adjustment in when a pill is taken can meaningfully reduce nighttime awakenings. Alcohol is another factor that deserves honest attention, because while a glass of wine in the evening might feel like it helps someone fall asleep faster, research consistently shows that alcohol fragments sleep in its second half of the night, suppressing REM sleep and increasing the likelihood of waking up in the early morning hours unable to fall back asleep, an effect that becomes more pronounced with age as the body metabolizes alcohol more slowly. Heavy or large meals eaten close to bedtime present a similar problem, since digestion competes with the body's ability to lower its core temperature, and a drop in core body temperature is actually one of the physiological triggers that helps initiate sleep in the first place. Napping habits deserve mention here too, since many older adults nap during the day without realizing how much that habit can push their evening sleep later and lighten it once it finally arrives. Sleep researchers generally note that a short nap, somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes, and taken earlier in the afternoon, tends to have little effect on nighttime sleep, but longer naps, especially those taken after 3 in the afternoon, can reduce what is called sleep pressure, the natural buildup of the chemical adenosine in the brain throughout the day that makes a person feel appropriately tired by evening. When sleep pressure is artificially reduced by a long late nap, the body's natural pull toward that 9 to 10:30 bedtime weakens, making it harder to fall asleep at the appropriate hour, and more likely that the whole schedule drifts later, which then compounds the very circadian misalignment we have been discussing throughout this video. Exercise timing matters in a similar way, since research published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine has found that moderate exercise, such as walking, light strength training, or swimming, performed earlier in the day is associated with deeper, more consolidated sleep that night, while vigorous exercise performed within an hour or two of bedtime can raise core body temperature and heart rate at exactly the moment the body is trying to lower both in preparation for sleep. For someone in their 70s or 80s working to shift their bedtime earlier and make it consistent, morning or early afternoon movement, even something as simple as a 20-minute walk, appears to reinforce the same circadian signal that morning light exposure provides, essentially telling the body clearly that this is daytime, so that the evening signal to wind down arrives on schedule several hours later. This is a natural place to mention again that smart psychology covers exactly this kind of practical research-backed guidance across many areas of health and aging. So if you want to keep learning how the body actually works, rather than relying on guesswork, sticking around here is a simple way to keep that information coming. Now let us put together what doctors and sleep researchers actually recommend as a practical target, based on the combined research from cardiovascular studies, circadian biology, and geriatric sleep medicine. The general recommendation for most adults over 70 is a bedtime somewhere between 9 and 10:30 in the evening, ideally landing close to that 10 o'clock mark that multiple large-scale studies have associated with the lowest cardiovascular risk, while still respecting the individual variation in each person's natural chronotype, since a small percentage of older adults genuinely have a slightly later or earlier internal clock than average. Alongside choosing a target bedtime, doctors emphasize keeping that bedtime consistent 7 days a week, including weekends, rather than treating sleep timing as something flexible depending on the day, since the research on irregular sleep timing shows that consistency itself is protective for the cardiovascular system, independent of the exact hour chosen. Morning light exposure plays an equally important role in supporting this evening timing, because exposing the eyes to natural daylight within the first hour of waking helps anchor the circadian clock and reinforces the timing of melatonin release roughly 14 to 16 hours later, that same evening, which is why sleep physicians frequently recommend a short walk outside in the morning, or simply sitting near a bright window with morning light, as a low-cost, evidence-based way to support healthy bedtime timing later that day. In the hour before the chosen bedtime, doctors recommend dimming household lights, moving away from television phone screens, and engaging in a calm, low-stimulation activity such as reading a physical book, listening to quiet music, or simply sitting and talking with family, allowing the body's naturally rising melatonin to do its work without being suppressed by artificial light. Keeping the bedroom cool, generally somewhere between 60 and 67 degrees Fahrenheit, supports the natural drop in core body temperature associated with sleep onset, and for older adults who are more sensitive to noise disruptions due to lighter, more fragmented sleep stages, using a fan, white noise machine, or earplugs can meaningfully reduce the number of nighttime awakenings. There is also a psychological and social dimension to sleep timing in older adults that researchers increasingly recognize as important, separate from the pure biology of the circadian clock. Loneliness and depression, both of which become more common after retirement, after the loss of a spouse, or after adult children move away, are strongly associated with irregular sleep schedules and delayed bedtimes, since an empty evening with no particular structure or reason to wind down at a set hour makes it easier to drift later and later in front of a television, simply to fill the time. Geriatric researchers, including those publishing through the National Institute on Aging, have pointed out that building a consistent evening routine, whether that means a scheduled phone call with family, a shared meal, or a regular activity with a community group, does more than provide social connection. It also gives the evening a natural shape that supports winding down at a predictable hour, rather than staying awake simply because there is nothing signaling that the day should end. This matters because willpower alone rarely sustains a new bedtime for long, but a routine built around real activities and real relationships tends to hold up far better over months and years. Another study worth mentioning comes from a large long-term analysis published in Nature Communications in 2021 by researcher Severine Sabia and colleagues, which followed nearly 8,000 adults over roughly 25 years and found that both consistently short sleep and highly irregular sleep patterns in midlife and beyond were associated with a meaningfully higher risk of developing dementia later in life, reinforcing from yet another angle how much the timing and consistency of sleep, not just its total duration, appears to matter for long-term brain health. Doctors also recommend avoiding large meals, alcohol, and caffeine in the several hours before the chosen bedtime, since caffeine in particular has a longer half-life in older adults due to slower liver metabolism, meaning a cup of coffee at 3 in the afternoon can still be measurably affecting the nervous system well into the evening hours for someone over 70. None of these individual pieces are complicated or expensive, but taken together, they align an aging body's actual biology with the sleep it is trying to get, rather than working against a system that has already shifted its own internal schedule. It is worth being honest that not every case of disrupted sleep in older adults comes down to bedtime timing alone, since conditions such as sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, chronic pain, and certain medications can all interfere with sleep quality, regardless of how disciplined someone is about their bedtime. And anyone experiencing persistent sleep problems, loud snoring, gasping during sleep, or excessive daytime sleepiness should absolutely bring that information to a physician, rather than assuming timing alone will fix it. But for the very large number of older adults whose sleep struggles come simply from staying up later than their body wants, fighting a circadian shift that has already happened, whether they acknowledge it or not, adjusting bedtime toward that 9 to 10:30 window represents one of the simplest, most well-supported changes available, backed by research spanning cardiovascular medicine, neuroscience, and sleep science, all pointing in the same direction. For anyone whose current bedtime sits far outside that 9 to 10:30 window, sleep physicians generally advise against trying to shift everything at once, since jumping from a midnight bedtime to a 9 o'clock bedtime overnight often backfires, leaving a person lying awake, frustrated, and anxious about not falling asleep. Instead, the recommendation is to move bedtime earlier in small increments, typically 15 to 20 minutes every few days, giving the circadian clock time to gradually recalibrate rather than forcing an abrupt change it is not ready for. Family members and caregivers can play a meaningful role here as well, since an older adult living with adult children or receiving regular visits often has their evening schedule shaped by when others are around, when the television is on, or when the household settles down, so a small conversation about supporting an earlier, more consistent bedtime, dimming shared living spaces earlier in the evening, or simply respecting that grandma or grandpa is heading to bed at 9, rather than staying up to keep them company, can make the difference between a good intention and a sustained habit. None of this requires medication, expensive equipment, or a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. It simply requires understanding what the body has already been trying to communicate and choosing to work with it instead of against it. Think back to that image of your grandmother in her chair at 8 in the evening, fighting to stay awake in front of the television because she thinks she is supposed to hold out until a later hour that made sense decades ago, and consider that her body was not betraying her. It was simply telling her, clearly and consistently, exactly what it needed. The science now backs up what that tired feeling was saying all along, that somewhere between 9 and 10:30 each evening is not a compromise or a sign of getting old. It is the window where an aging heart, an aging brain, and an aging body all get their best chance at genuine repair. If this kind of research-grounded look at aging and the body was useful to you, Smart Psychology puts out more content exactly like this, and following along is the easiest way to make sure you catch what comes next.